housekeeping details, introduction, and by the time I'm done with that, we'll probably have quite a few more people who've joined. All right, so welcome to the fifth and final lecture of the 2022 Biomedical Research Integrity Summer Lecture Series. My name is Karen Peterson. I'm the Director of the Office of Scientific Career Development and Scientific Ombuds at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center. I co-direct the BRI program with my colleague, Malia Fullerton, who's a professor of bioethics and humanities at the University of Washington. We're assisted in our work on the UW side by Melissa Cox of the Department of Bioethics and Humanities, and on the Fred Hutch side by Amber Ismail of the Office of Scientific Career Development. The United States Public Health Service and its research institutions require that all pre- and postdoctoral researchers supported by PHS training grants receive training in the responsible conduct of research. In addition, the Fred Hutch requires all of its pre- and postdoctoral researchers to receive such training. The UW and Fred Hutch have developed this program of lectures and discussion groups to help its researchers meet this training requirement. So just a few bits of housekeeping before we begin. Please note that this is a completely virtual program. Attendance credit is tied to the email address that you've entered into Zoom. So it's very important that you use one email consistently, and please type it correctly. If you cannot attend the lecture live, each lecture will be recorded and posted shortly after its live delivery. You will need to view the lecture and take the corresponding short content quiz before you receive credit for attendance. In addition, for those attending the UW-based discussion groups, it's an excellent idea to watch or review the lecture linked to each discussion section before you attend. We're using the Zoom webinar feature, which allows audience attendees to submit questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of the viewing screen, as opposed to the chat box, which has been, it's not functional. Please feel free to submit your question at any time. You may do so as an identified participant or anonymously if you prefer. One of the cool features of the Zoom webinar feature is that other audience members can read the questions they come in and have the option to upvote by clicking on the thumbs up icon. They can upvote any questions they're particularly interested in having our speaker answer during the Q&A. So please do not forget to complete the post-lecture evaluation that will be sent to you in your registration confirmation email. This is the primary way by which we can tell that you have attended and engaged with the lecture material. So with the housekeeping taken care of, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Lisa Bero. Is it Bero or Bero? Sorry, my apologies. I should have checked.
Bero.
Bero. Dr. Bero is a leader in evidence synthesis, meta-research, and studying commercial determinants of health, focusing on tobacco control, pharmaceutical policy, and public health. Dr. Bero is Chief Scientist at the Center for Bioethics and Humanities and Professor of Medicine and Public Health at the Colorado University Anschutz Medical Center. She's also Senior Editor for Research Integrity for the Cochrane Collaboration. Dr. Bero has developed and validated qualitative and quantitative methods for assessing bias in the design, conduct, and dissemination of research, and has pioneered the utilization of internal industry documents and transparency databases to understand corporate tactics and motives for influencing research evidence. Dr. Bero will be speaking today on themes related to the PHS required topic of conflict of interest with the title, Conflicts of Interest in Research and Practice. Lisa, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Karen. I am just delighted actually to present to this audience, and I've already seen some friendly names and faces on the chat, so that's just great. All right, thumbs up. Do you see my slides? Okay, and all right, good. So yes, please feel free to interrupt as we go along. And my topic today, in terms of conflicts of interest, there's always a lot to say, and so I actually wanted today to focus on some of kind of what's new and happening in conflicts of interest. You'll see my own disclosure there. I do receive some payment through the University of Colorado from Cochrane, and also some consulting fees from Health Canada, where I'm a conflict of interest advisor, which I'll talk a little bit about. And my funding is from government. So what is a conflict of interest? Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this definition. This is the most commonly used definition in medicine that comes from an Institute of Medicine 2009 report on conflicts of interest in research and practice. And it's a circumstance that creates a risk that professional judgment or action regarding a primary interest, so that might be doing research, for example, will be unduly influenced by a secondary interest, and that might be taking consulting fees from someone who makes the product that you're testing. So the real things to think about here are what's the primary interest of the activity, what's the secondary interest, and what sort of risk is created. And I want to emphasize that conflicts of interest are a risk. They don't always mean that they have a bad outcome. So why do we care about them, though? We care about bias. This is the real reason that people care about conflicts of interest. And so, as Karen mentioned, I do work on commercial determinants of health. And so I'm really interested in bias on research. And by that, I mean how we frame the question, how it's designed, how it's conducted, whether it's reported in full or not. And basically, if bias is introduced in any of these aspects of research, then we don't have trustworthy evidence. We can't do evidence synthesis, which is another thing I'm very involved in. And we can't have unbiased health or clinical practice guidelines, for example. So bias is really important. And we have actually quite a bit of evidence that conflicts of interest are associated with bias. And I'm not going to go over all of that today. I'm going to focus more on policy. But I just want to briefly say that I do meta research. So this is Bailey. He's a meta pug. He's quite an internet sensation. So he's a pug dog wearing a pug suit. He's very, very cute. And like a meta pug, meta researchers do research on research. So this is a systematic review and meta-analysis. It's a Cochrane review. I'm an author of this review. And basically, this is looking at many, many studies here that have looked at the association of pharmaceutical industry funding with the outcome of drug studies. So a study of a drug, whether it was sponsored by a pharmaceutical company or some other sponsor, was there a difference in the effect estimate? And what we see here when we put all these together in a meta-analysis is that pharmaceutical industry sponsored studies are more likely to have a larger efficacy estimate than those that have other sponsors like government. And then we've also looked at harm as an outcome, and they're more likely to have a smaller harm estimate. So all in all, this favors the product of the pharmaceutical industry sponsor. So there's very clear evidence across a wide variety of topic areas. This is just pharmaceuticals in terms of influence of funding source or conflicts of interest on research. But we also have a lot of interest in how these conflicts could influence recommendations. So this is another Cochrane review that was also published in the BMJ, where, and I'm an author of this one, but certainly not the first author. Camilla here is the first author of this really interesting study. And this looked at studies that examine the association of author conflicts of interest with the recommendations in clinical guidelines, advisory committee reports, opinion pieces, or narrative reviews. So basically things that aren't research, but where people come to a recommendation. And in this case, again, if the authors had conflicts of interest, they were more likely, about 26% more likely, to have a recommendation that favored the products of the company with which they had a conflict of interest. So this is important because it's showing that conflicts of interest have an effect on recommendations as well as the research itself, which I showed in a previous slide. Now, I have many, many talks that really go into this evidence on conflicts of interest. So I'm just going to kind of stop here with this high-level summary. And what I want to do today is focus on, like, how this actually plays out in practice. As many of you know from your different settings and your research, universities have conflicts of interest policies, journals have conflicts of interest policies, and guideline committees as well have conflict of interest policies. So I'm going to talk about my role in developing some of these policies for different organizations and how they're implemented. But I don't want you to forget that there's evidence behind the development of these policies. So first I'll talk about a university policy. I know many of you are working in universities, and surely they have conflicts of interest policies of different kinds. Now, the last 7 years, I worked at the Charles Perkins Center in Sydney, Australia, which is a large multidisciplinary research center that was part of the University of Sydney. And when I arrived, the Charles Perkins Center did not have a conflict of interest policy. So one of the first things I worked on was helping develop a policy for this center. So the policy is called the Engagement with Industry Guidelines. I arrived in 2014. By 2015, after a lot of consultation, we had a policy. And the first thing I want you to note there is our mission. The mission of the Charles Perkins Center was to do multidisciplinary research related to obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and other chronic conditions as well. So we are really a research center that, as I said, had no conflict of interest policy. So our policy required that a risk-benefit analysis was required for all Charles Perkins Center projects that were considering an industry linkage. And by that, I mean, it was either going to be funded by industry through a grant or contract, or the investigators doing the project had ties with industry, anything from a material transfer agreement to consulting agreements, for example. And this policy was implemented by a committee of people that included lawyers, administrators, faculty, and actually what are called early career researchers in Australia were part of this committee who made decisions and did this risk-benefit analysis. So these are the things we applied to the risk-benefit analysis. The mission test, we called it. Any industry funding, the funder had to be related to our interest of improving public health. The commercial interest could not have any control over the design, conduct, or dissemination of the project. I'm going to come back to that in a second. This is something most US institutions have this requirement, and it's taken care of usually through your contract that you have with the funder. The commercial interest could not prevent any publication or dissemination of the project in any way. But then we also considered whether there was a reputational risk to the Charles Perkins Center of taking the funding, and whether the funder had a poor record of corporate governance or responsibility. So doing work related to nutrition, for example, Nestle is a corporation that has a poor record of governance regarding research it's done on infant formulas and distribution of infant formula. So we just would not accept funding from Nestle. Another organization we didn't accept funding from was Coca-Cola, because they had a track record of influencing research agendas in the area of nutrition. So for companies that we would consider a relationship with, this is really the key component, and many of you at universities will have seen contracts that try to protect against any control over the design, conduct, or dissemination of the research. And that is a great thing, but I just want to caution that research has shown that contracts do not prevent industry control in many cases. So they're worded vaguely, they're not adhered to, frankly. So this is something that universities really need to be quite careful about. This is a study conducted by Christine Rasmussen that looked at clinical trials, randomized controlled trials of drugs, and looked at 200 industry-funded trials that were published in top peer-reviewed journals. And I want to note that all of these trials had the statement that said the sponsor was not involved in the design, conduct, or publication of this study. Many journals require that now, and this is what the Charles Perkins Center was striving for. But Christine actually interviewed the PIs of these 200 industry-funded trials, and this is what they said, that the industry sponsor in 92% of the cases was involved in the design, in 73% of the cases in the data analysis, and in 87% in the reporting of the study. And only about a third of 80 authors of the trials who commented on this said that the academic author had the final say. So this is just a word of caution that these contracts are really, really important, but they need to be well worded and they need to be enforced to prevent this sort of influence from the sponsor. And the Charles Perkins Center policy was very strict compared to other policies at the University of Sydney. And so there were some implementation challenges, but not as many as we thought, actually. The hardest challenge was getting the declaration of interest because academics had to fill out a special form for the Charles Perkins Center, and there were often inaccuracies or omissions in those declaration of interest. The other challenge, and I'm sure many of you are in settings where this happened, was dual appointments. And so if someone had an appointment in a department that had a less strict policy, they could potentially run their contract or their grant through that department rather than the Charles Perkins Center. That one is pretty hard to deal with unless you get coordination across the university. There's a lot going on right now to try to improve the accuracy and omissions we're getting in declaration of interest. Many of you have seen these electronic forms where people share the information, like in Convey, for example. And I do know of a couple of projects going on right now where universities are using the open payment database, and I'll explain what that is for those of you who don't know, to actually pre-populate the declarations of interest of their faculty. So at least they'll know that the open payments data is available on the declaration. And by open payments data, these are really only related to pharmaceutical industry funded researchers, but pharmaceutical companies in the United States and actually in many other countries, including Australia, report their payments to clinicians. And as of 2021, this used to only include doctors in the US, but now it includes other providers such as physicians' assistants and various types of nurse practitioners. So basically, universities, by looking at the open payments data first, can trigger investigators to know that they're aware of certain pharmaceutical industry payments. So we'll see how that plays out. And the reason for universities doing this in some cases is that there have been a number of studies that have shown that the information in an open payments database doesn't align with what investigators have disclosed in a journal or to their university. All right, so now I'm going to move on to a journal policy. And all of you are probably publishing, and you're aware when you submit to a journal that there's a conflict of interest policy. You have to make a declaration of interest, but you may not know, what happens actually once you make that declaration of interest. And this varies quite a bit by journal. And one journal I want to talk about is a journal called the Cochrane Library. So this is where I'm a research integrity editor for the Cochrane Library. And this is a journal that is a peer-reviewed journal, but it publishes only systematic reviews. And so that's very unique about the Cochrane Library. So it publishes evidence synthesis, editorials related to evidence synthesis, but that's it. It doesn't publish other types of research. So Cochrane has had a conflict of interest policy for quite some time, initially established in 2006. And then it was revised in 2018. And again, these policies, a lot of thought goes into them. And so what happened in 2018 was that the journal content was separated out from other Cochrane conflict of interest policies. So for example, policy for our governing board, policy for our scientific committee, policy for our various centers. So this was just for the journal content. And we had a committee that reviewed the conflict of interest policies of 33 organizations. We conducted a large online open survey, and 1,000 people, Cochrane reviewers around the world, responded. And we interviewed 16 internal and external stakeholders to the Cochrane Library. So all of this input, as well as review of the evidence, went into our conflict of interest policy.
Lisa, we have
Yes.
one question pertaining to university-focused policy. The question
Oh,
is,
great. Yes, that would be good before we move on.
yeah, are there university-wide policies, or are they all department-specific?
Oh, no, there are university-wide policies, definitely. And, you know, the university-wide policies, I would say, are more prevalent than departmental policies, but research centers. So I don't know if you want to comment on Fred Hutch, for example, because I don't know, but research centers tend to have separate policies, like the Charles Perkins Center. But when I was at UCSF, where I chaired their conflict of interest committee for 11 years, that was actually a university-wide policy for all of the University of California, San Francisco.
Thanks, Lisa. At the Fred Hutch, we have Fred Hutch-wide COI policies, but they are implemented in specific ways depending on the kind of research. If you're doing, you know, clinical research versus some other non-human subjects research, I think that there are within each division there can be professors who implement the COI policy based on the specific kind of research inherent in the division.
Right. So I think, you know, from the researcher standpoint, this can all be very confusing, because at, you know, any particular university in any particular department, you may be subject to a variety of policies. And so it's really important to know, you know, which ones are relevant for your research.
Thank you.
Okay, back to Cochrane. So Cochrane has a set of 10 principles, and we wanted our policy to be based on our principles. And these are the 4 principles that are most relevant to the conflict of interest policy for the Cochrane Library. So these are pretty obvious, but we want the Cochrane Library content to be independent of any influence, including commercial influence. We want it to be free from interference in terms of how the reviews are conducted, how the reviews are published. We want the users of the library to be assured that the product is independent. And we want to be transparent about authors' financial and non-financial conflicts of interest. And not only that, but how they're managed. And this is where we're quite different from other journals, because a lot of times, you know, you file that declaration of interest, but it's very unclear sometimes who at the journal reviews that, if anybody, and how it's actually reviewed. So these are aspects of our policy, and this is one that we've had since 2006. So this is not new, but this is that no review or any other content in the Cochrane Library, it can never be funded or produced by any commercial organization with a financial interest in the topic. So an obvious one is if there are drug products being considered as an intervention in the review, none of the makers of those drugs can be a sponsor, you know, a funder of the review. But this doesn't just apply to pharmaceutical companies. This applies to device manufacturers, to you know, any sort of commercial, like a psychological counseling package that's a commercial package. So anything like that. It's not just pharma. And then there's, of course, declarations, and any funder, which of course would not be someone with a commercial interest in the review, but say it's a foundation, they cannot interfere with the production or publication of the review. So those are pretty typical to other organizations. Now, we also have rules for authors of Cochrane Library content. So this is where, you know, if you're publishing in a journal, you fill out that declaration of interest, but very few journals, actually, I'll get to this in a second, have any rules about authors' financial or any conflicts of interest. And so in Cochrane, An author of a review cannot be currently employed or recently employed by an organization that has a financial interest in the outcome of the review. So again, that's all types of companies that could, be funding an intervention. They can't own such an organization either, have stocks in it. And if the Cochrane Review has multiple authors, which the vast majority of them do, at least 2/3 of them should have no relevant financial conflicts of interest. This was a very, very hotly debated point in the policy. Our 2006 policy said that at least half of the authors had to be free of conflict of interest. And there's a group that really wants them to be 100% having no conflicts of interest. So this is really a compromise position in 2018, where we increased the proportion of authors that cannot have a conflict of interest on a Cochrane review. And that's quite unusual. Most journals don't have that kind of restriction. And then we have a section on non-financial interests, and I'm going to get to these or talk about these a bit more in the terms of the guideline policy. But we do ask authors of Cochrane reviews to disclose in their declaration whether they have non-financial interests that might be relevant. And we ask them to think about how their this interest could shape their contribution to the development of the content. However, we're very clear that a non-financial interest will not prevent participation in a Cochrane review, like the financial interest can potentially. And so some of the things that we ask authors to think about are other publications or opinion pieces they've made related to the Cochrane review, their work, for example, could they benefit, if it's of a surgical intervention, is that related to their work as a surgeon, and any affiliations with organizations. But this is pretty general that we ask people to think about, and we don't have a very strict requirement for what they need to disclose, like a number of guideline organizations do. So how does the Cochrane policy compare to other journals? As you might imagine, having published in other journals, it's pretty strict if you haven't run into this kind of thing. And I compared the 2018 policy to the top 10 journals by impact factor, which is kind of our competitive pool in Cochrane, to look at their conflict of interest policies. And of these 11 journals, so the 10 plus Cochrane, all of them use the ICMJE disclosure form or some variant of it. As I said, Cochrane now uses it in Convey, and we've altered it a bit, and many journals do. But basically, we have that in common. Only one, Cochrane, prohibits industry funding of systematic reviews. However, 6 of the 11 had prohibitions of industry funding of certain types of articles. So BMJ, for example, does not allow education articles to be funded by an industry group. Some journals in tobacco control do not allow tobacco companies to publish. Their journal doesn't publish any articles funded by the tobacco industry. So there are some prohibitions in other journals for certain types of articles. None of the journals, including Cochrane, and as I said, this was hotly debated, prohibit any authors from having a conflict of interest. So all of them will allow authors with conflicts of interest in some proportion to publish. Only Cochrane has a limit on that proportion of authors that can have a conflict of interest. However, again, 6 of the journals had other prohibitions on conflicts of interest that authors could have. So for example, some journals prohibit authors who are employed by the company whose product is the subject of the paper or the study. Some prohibit authors that have over a certain dollar limit, for example, over $10,000 of financial interest with a company whose product is the subject of the study. Some prohibit authors who have stocks and equity in the company. And some are actually just kind of vague. One journal says they prohibit the conflict of interest if the editors judge it to be serious, but it doesn't tell you what that means. So this is just to say, even though Cochrane's policy is quite strict, it's also quite clear. And when you are submitting articles to a journal, you really do need to know their policy, because they differ among journals. And some of them do have these certain restrictions on conflicts of interest or funding sources that they allow in the journal. And it can also be hard to find these conflict of interest policies sometimes. So always good to ask an editor if you're uncertain. So now I'm going to move on to guidelines if there's any questions about journals at this point.
There's no open questions at this time, but I will speak up if one appears.
Okay, great. Well, I will move on to guidelines because they're quite a different kettle of fish. And I know many of you will be involved in either producing the evidence that's reviewed as part of guideline development, or you'll actually be on guideline committees. And so again, it's important to be aware of what their conflict of interest policies are, because they'll be different from universities and journals. And a lot of my work here relates to my work for governments, actually in Australia and Canada, in establishing conflict of interest policy around guideline development and implementing that policy. So a lot of this policy is based on a risk management model. And I just want people to know that this doesn't come out of nowhere. And in fact, Elizabeth Boyd, over 20 years ago, when she was working with me, did a really groundbreaking, and I'm sure many of you know Liz, qualitative study that looked into the factors that conflict of interest committees at universities thought about when deciding whether a conflict of interest needed to be managed or not, and how it should be managed. Because, you know, this is really the whole point here. These declarations come in, and then somebody or some group needs to make a decision about how these should be managed, or whether they're considered a conflict of interest at all. So there's been, not actually a huge amount of research on this. So this is quoting from Dr. Boyd's early work, which showed that the nature of the relationship is something people consider. Is it a financial conflict of interest? Is it personal, like a, marital relationship, a child, something like that? Is it relevant to the topic in question? What's the amount? You know, people have found that bigger amounts they tend to be more worried about, although there's evidence from open payments data that shows that even $12 will change prescribing. So, it's variable how people think about that. How long is the relationship? So is it basically an ongoing relationship of one investigator with a company over 20 years, or is it a bunch of one-off, honorarium with a bunch of different companies? What's the number of these? What's the type of company? Again, what's the relevant to the work in question, but also whether there's some reputational risk to the organization in some way. And I've mentioned tobacco a couple of times, and certainly many organizations in different sectors have rules. The WHO, for example, has rules about people on their committees not having any interactions with tobacco companies. And that's really just a reputational consideration. Were the payments directly to the person, or are they indirect in some way? And if they're indirect in some way, how much access does that person have to the funds? What's the level of control? So if somebody's getting paid to be a company board member, they obviously have more say over the direction of that company than if they're getting a one-off consultant fee to run some test samples. And then what's the actual risk of bias that we're worried about here? Is it a risk in the decision that's being made? Is it a risk in how the research is designed? Is it a risk in how transparent the data are going to be. So what is the risk we have to worry about? So all of this in terms of conflict of interest management on guidelines goes into a risk management model. And this is not used universally across guideline development, but it's used a lot more frequently, where conflicts of interest of guideline committee members are rated usually high, medium, low, or none. So this is based on their declaration. And you see this follows many of these considerations I was just talking about, all the way up from having a large amount, a long duration, large financial interest, down to no personal financial relationships, no control. And then the management strategy, and this is really important, is matched to the level of risk. And this is important because in implementing conflict of interest policies, we need to be sure they're applied equitably to all people who are subject to the policy. And so by, many people, when they argue against conflict of interest policies, they use arguments like, I'm not affected by conflicts of interest, or I have such a great track record of research, of course I couldn't be affected. And those really aren't valid considerations when managing conflicts of interest. We need to look at the interest and what's the risk it creates. And so the management strategies, when they're linked to the risk, make sure that the management is applied equitably to whoever is making the declaration. And here I just have some examples of the high risk ones, or if you're a company employee, a long-term consultant, or your spouse is a company employee. And then we can have, medium risk, or maybe you have grants from the company, but they run through the university and they're not, you actually do have control of the research, for example. Then we have these lower ones, which people are calling conflicts of interest now. I'll get to that in a second, but maybe you've published conversation or social media articles on your topic. So you've expressed an opinion, or you've testified before government committees. And then some I would rate as none are your academic track record. People have tried to say that your academic publications, if they're in a particular area or they've shown a particular finding, are a conflict of interest. And I would certainly argue against that. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second.
Lisa, we have a question.
Yeah.
From an anonymous attendee. It says, are there instances where COI policies do not apply to a particular individual?
Not that I know of. And I mean, that's a great question to follow on to my comment about conflict of interest policy being equitable. So in all of the policy development I've been involved in, there are no exceptions to individuals to whom that policy applies. If there are instances of that, I certainly wouldn't recommend it.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so a couple of things that are unique about guidelines are that the decisions.
Sorry, there's another question has come in.
Yeah.
So this question is, how are the COI policies enforced? As you showed at the beginning of the talk, people declare a lack of COI, but the reality is different.
Yeah, well, there's kind of two parts to that. So there's enforcing the declarations. And then secondly, there is actually enforcing the management strategy. So as I mentioned, at universities at least, and places that have open payments data, some of the enforcement of the declarations is taking place by groups checking the open payments databases, or checking basically publications of an individual to see if they've declared interest in other settings. Now, this is a resource intensive job, so it's not done across the board, but when it's been discovered sometimes that an individual has a track record of an inaccurate disclosure, I do know of organizations, both among journals and universities actually, that will then do this further checking for undisclosed conflicts of interest. And like I said, the main way to do that is through the open payment databases and what they've disclosed in other journal articles, for example, but also there's can often be a checking of university contract and grant databases to see who they're getting contracts and grants from. So that's, and then the other thing is there are instances where there are penalties against people who do not declare truthfully. And if they're caught, then they may not be able to, for example, submit. There's a couple of articles in, a couple journals, and I'm blanking on their names right now, but they're in environmental epidemiology, where if an author does not disclose truthfully, that author can't publish in that journal for the next 3 years. And then there's enforcement of the management strategies, and that's usually up to the institution to follow through and see if, for example, on a guideline committee, it would be the guideline committee chair that has to follow through and make sure that, an individual is not going to be involved in decisions about a particular product if that's related to their conflict of interest. Sorry, that was a long answer. I hope that is sufficient, but I can go into that more if you want.
That was great. Thank you so much. So there is another question. Do you want to get through this next section on the guidelines and then answer that next question and then others that might come up, or would you
okay. It's up to you. I don't care. So,
let's
but yeah, I guess
I'm looking at the time, and
I'm looking at the time. Let me press on, and I won't belabor the risk management. Yeah. So some unique things about guidelines is it's a group of people. Disclosure is the most common thing you'll see in guideline documents. But as I said, more people are applying these risk management strategies. And one area I've worked in a lot is dietary guidelines. And I'm just using them as an example here. So these are basically public health guidelines that are made at a national level that say, these are the best dietary recommendations for the country. The US has dietary guidelines that have been highly criticized because most of the members have had financial ties with food industry. So in the countries I've been involved in where we've had these dietary guideline and reviewed the conflicts, we have developed, and I'm not going to go through it word for word here, but it's just to say that a very detailed description of what's considered high risk and what's considered medium risk and what's considered low risk. And this is matched then to the management strategy. So I think this is kind of where the action is in guidelines. So for each type of guideline, there can be a very detailed plan for risk management that's specific to the guideline. Like here, a lot of people were concerned about authors of popular press books on dietary advice. They do profit from the sale of their book, but the thing is, that's a very narrow view compared to, for example, major food companies that profit very broadly from the selling of processed food. So in nutrition, we had many things to rank. And then this included low risk, what we call professional interest. And so these were things like working as a dietitian, receiving grants from non-industry sources, and then to minimal or no risk. And we actually rated these as minimal or no risk. And these were things like spiritual or religious affiliation. Some people have argued that if you're on a dietary guideline committee and you eat a particular diet due to your religion, you should disclose that. But will that really put the dietary guideline at risk? Is that going to influence across the board this whole committee, their recommendations? So we've rated, and again, this was a group process, these low, and also having to disclose whether you have dietary restrictions due to a health condition. So again, it was just this idea that making these very specific was very useful, and it made it very equitable to the applicants. Now, I've written a lot, and this is my last bit here, on these so-called non-financial interests. Quinn Grundy is a assistant professor in Toronto now who's collaborated on a lot of this work with me. And so we've done empirical research and we've written opinions on this. And in our empirical research, we have found that a lot of things have been labeled non-financial conflicts of interest. Everything from your sex. We had a person we interviewed who was a woman who was told she couldn't be on a guideline committee related to children's health because she was a mother. I kid you not. And then, we've had people say, well, so-and-so has a strong personality, so they shouldn't be on the committee. Well, that might be a problem, but is that a conflict of interest? This is the point here. And, we've seen, as I mentioned, we've had vegans, vegetarians, people who practice Tai Chi. It's been recommended they shouldn't be on committees. So basically, these are things that people are calling non-financial conflicts of interest, and we have labeled these an ethical shorthand in our paper. We think they don't fit the definition because they're not secondary interests. They're kind of part of who you are. There can be a huge invasion of privacy. So, for example, we've seen a committee on strategies or methods for abortion where women were asked if they've had an abortion or not, where men were not. And this can be very inequitable because it kind of begs the question of what's objective. So if vegans and vegetarians aren't objective, then you have to wonder, what do you have to eat to be objective? And then these, most importantly, cannot be managed in the same way as a conflict of interest. You can get rid of a conflict of interest, you can reduce it, you can restrict participation, but these don't apply for these other interests. So there are alternate management strategies. These are used very often in social science. There's something called reflexivity, where again, you would reflect and you put that in writing, how your view, for example, or your personal experience might affect whatever the outcome of interest is. And then on guideline committees, there's balance. And so if you're worried about having a vegetarian on the guideline committee, you can make sure you have a mix of people who are vegetarian or not. And then that one view doesn't dominate the committee, and it can hopefully be driven by evidence. So just to end, I think some of the take-home messages from today are that some policies are stricter than others. And so whatever organization you're dealing with, it does behoove you to know their policies. Complete and accurate declarations do remain a problem, but there's work going on to improve that, make it easier. And these non-financial interests, and I've only given you some examples, and I hope you read my papers if you're interested. They can be very important as sources of bias, but they should not be managed as a conflict of interest. They really need to be managed differently. So I'll just end there and stop sharing so we can have more of a discussion.
All right, thank you so much, Lisa. And we do have, hang on, let me manage my screen here so I can bring up the Q&A. So we have one question, and it is, for guidelines producing bodies that include clinicians, how are their conflicts managed, i.e. extending screening intervals would decrease visits and revenue? I've rarely seen their conflicts discussed, only researchers receiving funding, free testing, etc.
See, that's really interesting because that's the conflict of interest around your basically clinical practice area. So that was something that we have in some of the work I've done rated in the medium to low category. And so, for example, if it really is, I think a classic example is radiologists. If the intervention that the guideline committee is recommending involves x-rays or screening, and there's radiologists, it's actually a financial conflict of interest because they benefit directly and financially from more selling of that service. And then in other countries where maybe they don't have fee for service or that's not such an issue, then it's rated as a lower conflict of interest because they may benefit from having an intervention from their clinical practice promoted, but they don't benefit from it financially. And presumably other physicians would also benefit from other interventions that were covered in other guidelines. So again, there, the professional practice really depends on kind of how much financial interest there is.
All right, thank you. Oh, here comes another question. How are the non-financial interests disclosed, and what are the processes used to deal with them?
Yes, well, this is a really interesting topic because this varies greatly right now. And some organizations are very vague, and Cochrane is one of them. I'll give you that, because we don't want to kind of wade into the area of asking people to disclose things they feel uncomfortable about or that could violate privacy policies. So we ask very vaguely, do you have any other interests that you think are relevant to this review? I can't remember the exact wording, but it's something like that. However, other guideline committees, and I've given you the example of the abortion method one, and I've given you the example from dietary guidelines, they have asked very specific questions, you know, for people to disclose their dietary habits, their personal past experience with a certain intervention. They've asked people to disclose, you know, any sort of lifestyle, habit, religion. People have been asked deliberately to disclose religion. So I only know of guideline panels that have gotten really specific in those cases. And again, that's something, you know, I would recommend against.
All right, thank you. There's, please feel free again to put questions in the Q&A. In the meantime, I have a question that I feel like is only half formulated in my head, but it has to do with how are, I can imagine that committees that are producing guidelines are as good as the members of that committee. And so how are diversity, equity, and inclusion best practices being incorporated into the profession of conflict of interest and then infusing itself into guideline committees?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, many guideline committees or organizations, I should say, do have kind of a separate set of policies around committee membership. And so they will strive for diversity, inclusion, global representation. So for example, WHO has a huge list of criteria for committee members. And then the conflict of interest considerations are on top of that. So they put together a pool of members. Obviously, scientific expertise is one of the key criteria, but a pool of members that meet all of the other considerations. And then they go to the conflict of interest level, which may eliminate some members. But that's why it's also really important that the conflict of interest rules are applied equitably across that entire pool. And something that some organizations are doing, but not all, is to have a more open recruitment for members. I was involved at the dietary guidelines for Australia, for the country, which are still ongoing. And they had a public call for members to the Dietary Guideline Committee. And after that pool was assembled and met the diversity criteria and the scientific expertise criteria, then it moved on to the committee that reviewed the conflicts of interest.
Oh, very interesting, thank you. So we have another question that's come in. How are conflicts of interest considered in peer review for journals? Is it common practice for reviewers, editors, etc., to have to disclose COI?
Yeah, that is becoming much more common practice, but it certainly hasn't been historically. Cochrane has a conflict of interest policy for its peer reviewers, but it's not nearly as strict as the policy for the authors. So for example, a peer reviewer has to disclose if they've had any funding from a company that might be the subject of the intervention of the review. And that could preclude their participation of a peer reviewer. But if it's something else, like they've had a government funded, you know, study of that intervention, or they've had government and industry funded, they may be a peer reviewer, but then we also make sure, and this is where balance comes in, like the guideline committees, we have other peer reviewers. And some journals now, Cochrane is one, but many other journals in the last, I'd say, 4 years, have had their editors declare conflicts of interest as well. But this is kind of pretty new, actually, among the journals.
Great, thank you. So we probably have time for one more question. If anybody has a question they wish to ask, please don't hesitate to put it into the Q&A. So I'm not seeing any other questions come up. We'll give it about one more minute.
Either everybody's totally confused or it's now very clear, but conflicts of interest is very complicated, I must say. It shouldn't be so complicated.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you read the guideline and it's like, well, that makes perfect sense. And then someone comes to you with an issue and it's like, oh, I see.
The devil is in the details. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes. All right. I don't see any other questions coming up. So, oh, here is one. Yes. Okay. Is it fair to say that conflict of interest is about financial interest and non-financial interests are not COI, but more of the issue of the bias?
Yeah, I mean, the personal relationships are a non-financial interest that are certainly a conflict of interest. So it's not, it's not a clear division there. So having a personal relationship with someone is a conflict of interest. But I think where these other interests, which should not be considered conflicts of interest, are more the personal experience of an individual or the personal beliefs of an individual. And again, I'm not saying these aren't important, and I'm not saying they can't produce bias. You're right, they could be associated with bias, but they just can't be managed in the same way.
All right, thank you. And with that, we are at 2:59, so I think we should wrap up. Thank you so much, Lisa,
Thank you, Karen.
for giving this really fantastic overview of conflict of interest in the settings of universities and journals and guideline committees. Really appreciate it. I think we had some really interesting questions, and really thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.